Hello, hello. This is Raymond, New York Times top 10 best-selling author, adjusting the light so it looks good. And I'm about to do a podcast. I've created a new podcast and I'm about to do an episode for you right now. This isn't a video podcast, it's an audio like all the others, but I'm allowing you to see it on Facebook Live. You're going to actually come into my studio right here and you're going to watch me record an episode of my Respark Your Life podcast. Respark Your Life, the podcast that ignites the flame to live life on your terms. Respark Your Life, the podcast that ignites the flame so that you can live life on your terms. And on Mondays is a 1-hour interview with a world-famous multimillionaire celebrity so that you can learn a lot about their wisdom. And then on Thursdays is only about 10 minutes, and it's an incident from my own life in which I learned a huge lesson. And I want you to come with me now as I record it. I've got my gooseneck lamp with the Facebook Live iPhone facing me, and behind it I have a gooseneck light. You can see in my glasses the light, unfortunately. And then I've got a Yeti microphone here with a pop screen in front of it, and I've got my Macintosh computer turned on to the app GarageBand, which comes built in. And I'm going to turn it on in a second and record. And the recording will take hopefully about 15 minutes. And then if I have to edit it, I'll edit it after the show, after the Facebook Live. And then I will send it to my provider and he will put the music in and put the intro and extra in, all that stuff. And that'll be yet another episode in my podcast. And you're behind the scenes. It's like you're in it's not the dress rehearsal because this is live. It's like you're behind the scenes. You're behind the scenes. You're behind the drapes. Okay, here we go. Yes, and welcome to this exciting episode. And what is it called? It is called I don't like that. I stuttered. So I'm just going to stop it and then erase it and go back to the beginning. I wasn't really ready, but now I'm ready. Do the number of breaths matter? Do the number of breaths matter? Okay, here we go. And this episode is entitled, Do the Number of Breaths Matter? Do the number of breaths matter? Well, there's a famous line that says, life is not measured by the breaths you take, but by the moments that take your breath away. Life is not measured by the breaths you take, but by the moments that take your breath away. And I'm going to investigate this because I've noticed that many cliches or famous sayings are wrong, but people just repeat them. Why? Heaven knows. I'll give you an example. There's one that says, stick to it. He says, yeah, stick to it, like Raymond always says. I never say that, ever, ever. Why? Stick to what? Stick to beating your wife? Stick to taking street drugs? Stick to overdosing on alcohol? I never say stick to it because you're not telling me what the it is that you're sticking to. And so I always in my life listen to metaphors and cliches and famous sayings and decide for myself if I believe it. And this time I'm not going to decide for myself. I'm going to let you decide. I'm going to take both sides of the argument. I'm going to take the pros and the cons, the yeses and the nos, and give you examples of each and let you decide. Because everybody totally believes life is not measured by the breaths you take, but by the moments that take your breath away. Everybody would say, oh yes, very wise. But is it? Let's just see. Let me take you back, about 12 years ago. I was asked to be the master of ceremonies at an event held in Hawaii, and the people at the event were all the most famous professional speakers in the world, over 100 of the world's most famous transformational leaders. And I was asked to be the master of ceremonies. Wow, what an honor. I was scared. And I was up on the stage, and an introducer's job, a master of ceremonies job, is quite complex. You have to be exciting in order to keep the audience excited, but you can't be too exciting, because if you're too exciting, you'll detract from the actual speakers. So you have to be exciting enough, but not too exciting. Now, the speakers can be as exciting as they want, but not the MC. So it's a balancing act. And at one of the breaks, I decided, oh, what the heck? Let's break the rule and be so exciting that nobody will remember anything except what I say at this break. And what did I do? I invited my girlfriend, who was sitting in the front row. I invited her up on stage. She didn't want to come. She's quite shy, certainly way more shy then than now. I invited her up, and I reached behind the drapes and pulled out a bouquet of flowers. And then I reached behind the drapes and pulled out a little jewelry box. And then I got down on my knee, on one knee, and I opened the jewelry box, and there within is a ring. And I said, "Sweet Karen, will you marry me?" And she may have answered, but the crowd went wild. As soon as they saw me getting on my knee with a little jewelry box in my hand, they all knew me. They screamed and screamed so loudly, they clapped so loudly that I didn't hear her answer. And so I was there sitting on my, not sitting, but kneeling on my knee, waiting for her answer. I said, "I can't hear you, you have to say it." And she finally said yes, and I got up and I hugged her. And then, believe it or not, I fell over and broke my leg. Honestly, I fell over and broke my leg. The only saving grace was that the videographer turned off the recording when she said yes, and thankfully missed by a few seconds my falling backwards and breaking my leg. Yes, I was rushed to the hospital, and I came back in a wheelchair and a cast. Now, why did I tell you that story? Because the entire proposal took maybe 3 minutes. And even if you include breaking my leg, racing to the hospital, waiting in the hospital, having the cast set, coming back in the ambulance and wheeling back in, maybe it was a few hours. But I'll never forget that incident. And so if it's only several minutes, then the length of time, it seems that it doesn't matter, because even though it was only a few minutes of that proposal, I'll never forget it. Sometimes things take much longer. So for example, I remember the day that I fell in love with Randy Pandy. I was in university and I fell in love with her. We were walking through a park, High Park in Toronto, and she walked in front of me, and for some reason, she just sat down on the grass and laid back and looked up at me, and I had my heart exploded, and the sky turned pink, and classical music started playing, like all the things that are a cliche that if you saw it in a movie, you'd say, "Give me a break." But it happened to me. I actually fell in love. That whole incident took maybe several minutes. But I went to camp. I started at age 4 and I finished at age 12. So that was 8 years. I went to camp for 8 years, and I remember camp as fondly as that several minutes of falling in love and the several minutes of proposing. I remember studying mathematics and physics for 4 grueling years at the University of Toronto. It was indeed the most difficult maths and physics course that the university had ever offered. It was so grueling that they took 400 of the most genius math scholars that had just graduated from high school in the northeastern end of North America. They took 400 geniuses who had never scored under 90% in any math test or exam in their entire life, and they failed half the class in mathematics after the first year. Not only did I pass, but I got first class honors and stood 22nd in the whole course, either 22nd out of 200 that passed or 22nd out of 400 that started. And finally, in the final year, 60 people started, Thankfully, we all graduated in our 4th year, and I stood 8th in the course, 8th out of, and with first class honors, 8th out of 60 or 8th out of 400, however you want to measure it. But those 4 years have the same kind of memory as the 8 years of camp and the several minutes of falling in love with Randy Pandy and the several minutes of proposing to Karen. I remember the 60s. I remember the 60s. Elvis, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Bob Dylan. The music was powerful. The music was exciting. There were peace rallies, and we all hated the Vietnam War. And it was so thrilling. And I didn't know that it was just the 60s. We didn't know during the 60s that the 60s would be called the 60s. We thought that music was always going to be powerful, but then it faded away. The 60s lasted for a decade, but that decade in my mind has the same power as the several minutes of falling in love with Randy Pandy and the several minutes of proposing, much later, of course, to Karen. I remember I was a high school teacher in North York in Toronto for 2 years, and I got the top math students and I excited them, and I was a thrilling teacher, and many of the students stayed after class just because they liked being around me. All of the teachers were called Mr. or Mrs. I told my students they should call me Raymond, and they loved it. And I remember I started Canada's first newspaper and tin recycling depot. And people said, why recycle? Just throw it away. Like, at that time, 1969 to 1971, people didn't understand cause and effect. They thought there was a place called away where you could throw stuff. If you threw it away, it somehow disappeared. Or the land called away land actually existed and just kind of sucked up the litter and the waste, and it actually went away, but it didn't. But people didn't know that then. I had to actually teach why you should recycle. Everybody knows it now, but it had to start somewhere, and it started then. I remember those 2 years with the same intensity and love as the few minutes of my proposal and my 1-year honeymoon and the decade of the 60s and the 4 years studying maths and physics and the 8 years or so that I was at camp. And I remember it as intensely as when someone said to me, my dear friend Jan Meek, she said to me, would you like to tie for last racing to the North Pole? I said, tie for last with who? She said, me. I'm going to race to the North Pole. You want to join me? And I said, yes. That whole thing took less than a minute, but changed my life. And so, no, I don't think that time matters. I don't think that time matters at all, because some moments of my life lasted a minute, and some moments of my life lasted 10 years, and in my recollection, in my intensity of recollection, they all seem to have the same value, whether they took a minute or a decade. So that's one side of the coin. Time doesn't matter. And maybe that's how you will vote. But let me now be the candidate for the other side and tell you that time does matter. And how am I going to do that? I have a dear friend, Martin. I love him intensely. And we have been together as dear friends for over 30 years. You cannot have a lifelong friend in a minute or a decade or 6 years or 8 years. You cannot have a lifelong dear friend in anything less than 30 years or a lifetime. My dear, dear friends, Pete and Paul, my dear friends, Donna and Justin, I've known them for almost 20 years. My dear, dear world-famous friend, Jack Canfield, we've been dear friends for 30 years. You can't have a lifelong friend in less than a lifetime. There's a certain quality of friendship that doesn't get created in an instant. Yes, of course, you can notice somebody at a party and have a strong feeling towards them. Yes, of course. You can get to know somebody very deeply, but you can't have a lifelong friend unless you've known them for a lifetime. So there you are, my podcast listener. Is it true that time doesn't matter, that the length of time doesn't matter, that intensity can occur in a moment, or intensity can take 10 years? Or on the other hand, is it true that time does matter, that you cannot have a lifelong friend, a dear, dear, deep friend in less than a lifetime? So you get to vote. Leave your comment. And if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. And if you want to just listen to my hour-long interviews, then just tune in on Mondays. And if you really like these Respark Your Life 10-minute or 15-minute episodes, then just tune in on Thursdays. And if you like the variety, then enjoy both of them. But please subscribe. Please enjoy this. Please leave your comments. Indeed, comment on whether the length of time matters or whether the length of time doesn't matter. It's your choice. I'm not going to balance the scales. I'm not going to actually unbalance the scales. Yes, that's what I mean. I'm not going to unbalance the scales by giving you my opinion in advance. It's an honest, secret ballot. How do you feel? And my intent was that this little quiz, this little comment, this little juxtaposition, this little dichotomy of two sides is going to re-spark your life and cause you to think a bit, cause you to decide whether you're on one side or the other. Thanks for listening to this amazing episode of Respark Your Life. So now I've turned off the GarageBand. It took 14 minutes and 9 seconds. That's a good time for a 10 to 15 minute episode. And just for fun, I've also recorded it so that you can enjoy it. Now, actually, did you enjoy it? Why don't you leave a comment? Did you enjoy it? You can say, yes, I enjoyed it, or no, I didn't enjoy it. And also, why don't you vote? Does the length of time matter, or does the length of time not matter? I'm looking forward in the Facebook Live for your comments today immediately. And I'm also looking forward whenever this gets broadcast through my podcast. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to your vote then. And if you want to subscribe, dear Facebook Live listener, just go to aaron.com, aaron.com/respark, aaron.com/respark. Or just go to your favorite podcast platform and type in Respark Your Life and you'll find it. Thank you.